Welcome to Illuminating Catholics, podcast of the Diocese of Sioux City. I'm Dawn Prosser, Director of Communications for the Diocese. Together with Carmen Bauer of the Faith Formation Office, we will shed light upon topics of faith in the modern church. Our guests include Catholic clergy, religious sisters, and other experts in their fields to help us understand what's happening in the church today. We will explore issues, even the tough ones, and to find answers to common questions about Catholicism. Thank you for joining us for today's Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church. Welcome back to the Illuminating Catholics podcast. I am Dawn Prosser, and I am Director of Communications for the Diocese of Sioux City.
And I'm Carmen Bauer. I am the Director of Faith Formation for the Diocese.
We're so pleased that you're joining us for yet another episode. We love that you're following all of our different topics and listening. And from beautiful and, I will guess, warm San Diego, California, we have Father Emmet Farrell joining us via video conferencing. He's a native Ayrshire and a graduate of Emmetsburg Catholic High School. He recently celebrated 60 years as a priest serving the church, and in 2023, he received the Pope John XXIII Award by the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests for his missionary work and his leadership in implementing Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical. Although he officially retired in 2009, he continues his creation advocacy work, and we look forward to hearing more about this in the podcast. Welcome, Father Emmet Farrell.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here.
Glad to have you.
Share my little story of life. Yeah.
Well, we're so happy you can join us today. And before we jump in to the topic at hand, would you just be able to start with sharing with us your background, your vocation story, how you came to discern the priesthood?
Okay, well, I grew up on a farm in Iowa. I had 5 brothers and 2 sisters, and we were always busy taking care of the animals, taking care of the crops. And I think the reason I became a priest was due in part, or perhaps unknown to me, but the example of my 2 parents, especially my mom. She had us on our knees praying the rosary every night. And they were very faithful at the little church in Ayrshire, and then we switched over to Emmetsburg, 10 miles away. We rode the bus to school. And the thing that really, I think, changed and brought me to think of priesthood was I stole the family Bible and I took it to my room and I closed the door and I started reading it. Because in those days, Catholics just didn't read the Bible. And I was amazed at this guy, Jesus. It's just, and it began to speak to me as I would be walking through life. These thoughts were ruminating in my head. So the night that I told my parents I wanted to become a priest, it was a total surprise to them, and it pretty much was to me. But those would be a couple of the things that I'd point out as my vocation story was reading the scriptures, especially the New Testament. And that walked with me as I walked through life. It was really speaking to me. And my parents didn't know what to say. My dad said, that's the nuns put that in their head. I said, no, they don't know about this. We'll take you to see the pastor. So I went to the pastor in Ayrshire, and he asked me, who told you to be a priest? And I just pointed up. I don't know what else to say. That was kind of the end of the interview. But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell, the story, I guess.
Well, how wonderful. Were you in high school when you had those conversations?
Yes, I was.
And so you entered seminary right after?
Right out of high school. I went to St. John's Collegeville and then back to Dubuque.
Well, that's so awesome. And I imagine that your relationship and prayer with Scripture continued throughout your entire life and then your priestly ministry. Oh, wonderful. So a couple years ago, you were honored in part for your missionary work in Latin America. So what took you from Emmetsburg and becoming a diocesan priest and all the way down to Latin America for missionary work?
Well, I only served like 3 years in the diocese, and in each one of the assignments, I was also put in as teaching. And I didn't feel I was cut out to teaching. I wasn't one of those who went to Creighton every summer for educational classes, for one thing, but teaching and I didn't get along that well. So I was looking for something more, adventuresome, interesting, And I knew priests who had gone to Latin America from the diocese. They had joined the St. James Foreign Missionary Society. So we were on a priest retreat. I walked up to Bishop Grudem and asked permission to speak. And he said, "What do you want?" And I told him what I was thinking. He said, "Well, you have to write a letter to Bishop Mueller," which I did. And then I heard nothing. And then one day the phone rang, and a recruiter from St. James was going through, and he wanted to talk to me. And I was in the Mars at the time, St. Joseph's. And so I met him for coffee, and we talked. And that was the beginning of my joining up with the St. James Foreign Missionary Society. When we did join up, there was a group of about 5 of us left. Boston Cardinal gave us the mission cross and sent us off to 3 months of training in Spanish in Lima, Peru. And then we were sent out to a parish. And I remember a couple things struck me real. The culture was all different. And of course, the language, we were learning the language. So I would listen to somebody and I start asking questions. Did you say this? Did you mean this? And little by little, you have to have a good ear to learn a language, and I'm not a great linguist. But the thing that struck me, the culture was different. Besides the language, the food was different, and especially the people. And especially the fact that, to my vision, they were very poor people. They came out of the hills in the 60s, 70s. They built an adobe hut overnight because there were invasions. And in the morning, there would be a whole city laid out. And they would build brick by brick, almost literally that, building their houses. My real education into Latin America, which really changed my thinking for life, came from a couple meetings that I had. We call them deanery meetings. And I went to one of those, and I was new, and they were talking about something, so I raised my hand to talk, and I just got started. Someone cut me off and said, "What group are you speaking for?" I didn't know what to say. He said, "Well, here we speak from groups." In other words, shut up. A couple months later, we have another meeting, and there's a problem in the area. And so they're talking about, what to do and so on. And again, I raised my hand and started to speak, and again, I was cut off. And the person said, "How many people can you put in the street tomorrow?" So I had to shut up. What they were getting at was, did we form leaders? Did we have people who were, we would say, concientizados? They knew what the problems were, the roots of them, but they also knew what the church's teachings were, what they call a base, a base. If you didn't have a base, you weren't to speak. I mean, you were just your own individual opinion. And that was a very important moment in life in my introduction into Latin America. There were a couple of documents that were key. One of them was a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Pablo Freire. I think he's from Chile. But it was a system of conscientization. It was a little bit like synodality here today.
Okay.
But you had to walk with the people, think with the people, and you lived with the people. The other thing that was very instrumental was Vatican II, which ended in about this year I was ordained, 65. 3 years later, I was in Peru, and the Conference of Medellin, Colombia, took place. And they said two things that were just bombs going off, in my mind anyway. They spoke about the preferential option for the poor. These are the people that Jesus loved. These are your people. The second phrase was institutionalized violence. What they meant by that was that the systems of rich and poor, where the rich are very few but own most of the things, and the poor are the majority, own very little. That's a violent situation. It leads to violence. It leads to some type of rebellion. And so those two things, as far as documentation, along with just the process that I mentioned, just learning to walk with the people, learn with the people. One priest who came from Australia, I was talking to him one night, and he said, "Well, you guys are really being evangelized by your people." It was true. The gospel made sense as we got closer to our people. And also we were becoming, perhaps unknown to us, a little bit And I couldn't say this then. I couldn't say it for about 30 years after I came back. A little bit anti-capitalistic. That was very much ingrained in the Latin American people because it was like they were under someone's foot or under someone's thumbnail. Strive as they might, their country, and they just scraped by. The people raised the questions in our minds, what is this? Why is this? And the church, especially in Latin America, was very vibrant, still is. They do a see, judge, act. They meet about every 10 years and say, what are the problems we're facing? Let's do a social analysis so we know what we're talking about. Now, what does Scripture tell us? What does theology tell us? And putting those two things together, what's our pastoral plan for the next 10 years or so? They just did it. The bishops of the Global South, I would attribute most of that to the Latin American bishops, CELAM, Conferencia Episcopal Latinoamericana. They've been doing it for years. And it's kind of the see, judge, act. That was a system that was grained into us as well, working with youth. Look at reality. What's wrong? What does Scripture say? What's the church say? Okay, what's our plan? That was the think box. That was what we were taught to think and do.
What an incredibly unique and formative time that must have been, and it sounds like you're still able to unpack from that experience and the examples that you saw and how the church functions. It's so incredibly important for us as Americans to be able to have those insights from the church around the world, because there's so much we can learn from our brothers and sisters regardless of where they live, and especially with the strong faith, as you mentioned, vibrant faith and that leadership of those bishops. When you came back to the United States, it sounds like you moved around for quite a bit after your missionary work, or you had some unique opportunities. Can you share with us a little bit about that and what led you to San Diego? We're all a little jealous that.
More than a little.
I was literally a fish out of water. I couldn't fit in. I asked the bishop to go to the Mexican-American Cultural Center, MAC, in San Antonio, Texas, to learn how to work with Mexicans. Because I thought, this isn't Peru, so it's a different animal. So we were there 3 months. And then I looked around and I thought, I got to go somewhere where there's a lot of Hispanics. Well, down the road was Houston, Texas, and I was allowed to go there. And I ended up meeting a group of people. They were Salvadorans, refugees, I guess you would call them. And they had one little room. And they had one lady who was kind of their leader. But Salvadorans were very ingenious people. They organized fast. They learned the American system fast. But we opened a house on a shoestring. One parish was supporting us, plus the Quakers. Every week they would come with a sack of rice and a sack of beans. That would keep us alive. And so we ran that house for a couple of years. And then I realized that the Salvadorans were way ahead of the game. They didn't need our help, but the ones who did were the Guatemalans. They were very meek. They spoke less English. They were not as organized. They weren't thinking about the system, the American system. So we opened a second house, but I still wasn't fitting. There was a sister working with me. And I saw one day an ad that Marino was looking for someone to run a program for them, their sanctuary program. And so I volunteered for that. So I went to the Knoll. I was there that year. And my intention was to join Marino, to go back to Latin America or somewhere in the missions. And we got done. I walked in the office and said, I'm ready to go. They said, no, you have to make a month retreat. I said, no, I'm ready to go now. No, you got to make a month retreat. So we made a month retreat. We got done. They said, you have to write a discernment statement. Oh, okay. And to this day, I swear, this is the only time this has ever happened in my life, I swear that the Holy Spirit took the pencil and wrote, stay in the United States and work with parishes. They do not have enough Spanish-speaking priests. And I looked at it. I shook my head. I couldn't even believe that I wrote it. But then I had to say, well, where am I going? Well, where are the Hispanics? I thought, well, let's see. I'm from the Midwest. Let's go to Chicago. So I had permission to go to Chicago. I was there about 8 years. A couple of years in a parish on the north side. It was very Hispanic. And then a job came up that interested me. It was a Hispanic coordinator of a vicariate. Chicago had, I guess they still have, 6 vicariates each one has an auxiliary bishop in charge. I was in the vicariate in the north side. A letter came through one day from the Bishop of Sioux City. I think it was Bishop Gretham at the time. And he asked me to either incardinate in Chicago or come back to Sioux City, that I'd be incardinated somewhere where I was working. And again, I was thinking, well, I know in Chicago that they wanted to put me in an area as a pastor where there were very few Hispanics, and that wasn't my cup of tea. And I thought, well, I didn't know how many Hispanics were in Sioux City, but I didn't think there were that many. But by a fluke, and I really mean this, I ended up in San Diego. Came to visit my sister who lives here, still does. And I said to her, I want to talk to somebody who's working with Hispanic ministry. Well, she just picked up the phone the next day and said she wanted to talk to the bishop. She said, my brother's coming, he's a priest, he wants to talk to you. I got there and she said, oh, you have a meeting tomorrow with the bishop. I said, what? So I went to talk to the bishop. And he said, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I wished I knew, but I said, I came to see Hispanic ministry here. How are you doing it? So he called the Office of Social Justice, or the Hispanic office, and the guy was to take me out to lunch and take me to one of the Hispanic parishes. Interestingly, it was St. Jude's Shrine of the West where I ended up as pastor when I last pastorate with that parish. But we went there. But the thing that was impressive to me was that the bishop said, I can put you in a parish right on the border. So I came to San Diego and went to San Isidro, which is about a mile from the Mexican border. And that was another whole education. I remember going out every Saturday. We'd go out and knock on doors. And one Saturday we got out and we looked over and there was another group over there and they were doing the same thing, but they weren't Catholic. We were setting up Bible study groups. And after a while, I think I was there about 8 years. I was pulled up a notch towards the center of the city in St. Anthony of Padua Parish. Again, a very Hispanic and bilingual parish. And then to a third one a few years later, which was St. Jude's Shrine of the West, a big parish. And I retired there from St. Jude's Shrine of the West parish. That was in 2009. So after I retired, I have to be doing something or I'm nervous. I started to publish books. I had brought with me from Peru a program that was very successful there. It was called Family Catechesis. Parents prepared their children for First Communion. And there was no TV there to run competition. So people loved to get together with their neighbors and their dirt floors and their adobe huts and talk. And I would go around visiting them. And the people who got evangelized, of course, were the parents, because they're talking about the Bible and God, and they're talking about that to their children. I thought, how can you beat that? Well, we spent 7 years publishing those 14 books, 7 Spanish, 7 English. And the program basically went nowhere. I should have known that the culture here, and even before I just gave it back to the parishes, I probably should have adjusted it to say, well, come in once a month, because the program was set up for them to come every week for an hour and a half and then go home and talk to their children. Great program, but it didn't fit the American culture. Could see it was going nowhere. I gave it back to the parishes. There were 3 or 4 parishes, so there's a couple that still do it, only in Spanish. And in 2017, I had turned back around, facing the front a little bit, because Pope Francis came off with his encyclical. And I thought, wow, this is something I can dedicate the rest of my life to. This is a very comprehensive encyclical. It covered all the bases: this, politics, economy, spirituality, culture, you name it. It was all there. And it was a problem that not only did I know little about, but the people knew little about. Climate change, what's that? Climate's always changing. Well, global warming. And you know the rest of that story. Anyway, I walked into the social justice office, which it was now, it's Life, Peace, and Justice office. And the director looked at me and said, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I want to start a ministry. what about? And I told him, I said, the environment based on Laudato Si. He said, go for it. So I started to put together a workshop based on Al Gore's slides, and I went to take his course up in LA. And of the 97 parishes in San Diego, I probably reached 30 of them before COVID. We have 5 Catholic high schools, and I was invited to go to preach on Laudato Si in all 5 of the high schools and probably half a dozen of the grade schools. When COVID hit, it's like everybody else, you know the rest of that story. It was a leveler. Everything stopped, and we lost pretty much what we had. But in the meantime, people had been coming out of the woodworks. Earth Day here in San Diego then was huge. There'd be like 100,000 people would go to Balboa Park, which is like Central Park in New York City. It's the heart and core of the city, and there would be booths for everything. So I decided to open a booth, and people would stop and look, what's the Catholic Church doing here? And then people would come up and say, wow, one of my best friends, one of the first people ever to join was an engineer. Spent time in Vietnam, and he worked for the electric company here. So he knew the ins and outs of why our energy was so expensive. But over the few years since 2017 to the present, we have a team of 10 very educated people, engineers, medical doctor, 2 lawyers, religious brother. We have 3 young adults that have joined us. One is a regenerative farmer who owns like 1 acre. There's another guy who is a spiritual director, getting his degree in spiritual direction and psychology. And a young woman that I met on a student march, and I met her at one of the parishes, and for years she was on my list and receiving emails, and she never answered. All of a sudden one day she showed up and had a course for young adults. So she is working with young adults. Anyway, the team has grown, and we were doing things in team fashion. At the Diocesan Institute, parish to parish, we had our specialties. The engineers handled the reality, the science. I and some of the 2 of the women lawyers are also secular Franciscans, plus the religious brother. And then in 2022, a very generous donor gave me money, and we hired a director, Dr. Christina Slintz. And she was like a jet airplane taking off. I mean, she just did things I could never do. She has us on Facebook, Instagram. It has a big impact in Southern California. We have had a booth at the LA Religious Congress the last 2 years. We're trying to get a speaker there, but there's a filter. Only once. Cardinal McElroy and a doctor by the name of Ramanathan from India was on the Pontifical Academy of Science. They jointly, during COVID, went on Zoom and gave a talk. That's the only talk that's ever been given on climate change at that conference. But we've been there for the last 2 years. This year we're going to have 2 booths. So the director that we have right now, as a matter of fact, today she is meeting with the Dicastery of Integral Human Development in Rome, because she went there to walk through the Holy Door, she and her husband. And she wants to go to Casal Gandolfo, the 5-acre garden that Pope Francis set up. She wants to see the garden because she wants to revamp the whole landscaping at the pastoral center and then try to get people to have family gardens. And she has been a real advance for our ministry here, locally, regionally, and even nationally. Together, I set up a 2-day session, two Wednesdays following. We had 2 speakers each night. And it was through the Association of the United States Catholic Priests. And so the last evening was at Notre Dame. She's a graduate of Notre Dame, so she went there. She and Professor Phil Sakimoto, were the 2 speakers for the evening. So we've had a great, in the Catholic Climate Covenant, she writes the report, which I started doing and now she's doing, which meets every month in the diocese across the country. And she also is now I think, asked to be the leader of the Laudato Si movement.
That's wonderful.
Which has become very strong. They held something in Rome with Pope Leo right before COP23.
Mm-hmm. I just want to point out one thing, that it was the first Latin American Pope that inspired this fantastic ministry that you were able to get going. And then actually I was on the mailing list that you sent out about your presentation regarding the messaging from the bishops of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean regarding the COP30, the Conference of Parties, and the effects of the climate crisis. And I thought it was really interesting what you said earlier in the podcast about the disparity between the poorer and the richer nations, and just kind of that mindset in Latin America regarding capitalism. So I found it really interesting, and thanks for sharing your slides too, about the disparity again between the poorer and the richer nations in regarding to the climate crisis. I know we don't have time for the whole presentation, but if you could share with the listeners a little bit kind of what those bishops very strongly said.
Well, to begin with, I think it's the first time that they ever spoke as the bishops of the global South.
Okay.
And you right away say, what's the global South? Well, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean is a big slice of the world. And these are the Catholic bishops. They are speaking as poor countries, and they are the ones who have suffered the most from the climate change, contributed the least, suffered the most. In fact, they've been trying through COP meetings. I think it was maybe, which one was it? They spoke about loss and damage, what they have suffered because of the warming climate, because of droughts, migrations, lack of water, and whatever else, infestations. But it has never really seriously been done. In Paris Accords, 190 nations did sign some willingness to pay for the damage that they have incurred by their industrial ways, especially the burning of fossil fuels of gasoline and petroleum. This group took it to heart. They're saying they're not really taking this seriously. So we are going to demand that they do this. And they set up something that I thought was really novel. They set up an ecclesial observatory to monitor what nations were doing with their commitments. Are they keeping their commitments? And if they weren't, they were going to call them out. They were going to denounce those nations. That's getting pretty strong. Mm-hmm. And they invented a couple of phrases. One of them was extractivism. We're extracting from nature and the resources for profits. I guess you could put oil in that category, or the oceans, the soil, whatever. It's all become industrialized, and it's profitable, but it's also polluting or damaging. The other word was commodification. We're making creation and nature a commodity. We can use it, buy it and sell it, waste it, throw it away, whatever we want for profit. They were pointing this out. This is all very probably raises some people's anger that they say this.
Probably.
But they say it. And they say, we demand this. We demand equity, that the rich nations pay for the loss and damage, that they help us make up for what they have caused. And of course, not everybody agrees with that. They caused this. So it's, but it was it's a very strong document. It talked about protecting the indigenous peoples. And they talked about a category that is very seldom mentioned: women and girls, especially in the undeveloped countries of the world. I'm sure you've heard about the what do you call it, this CJAB, headdress, the CJAB, whatever it is called. But women and girls do a lot of the real work and are not treated like in a human fashion, so to speak. Immigrants, they migrate because they can't make a living where they are. Here in San Diego, we see immigrants not treated with human respect. I don't know whether you heard about it, but we have a ministry. We go and sit in the courts. Mm-hmm. And recently we're not going to the courts so much as we're going down to the room where they are manacled, handcuffed, led off to be deported, or put in the basement jail or in other jails. And we sit there, we pray with them. The last time I was there, I was a assigned person, Spanish-speaking person. I was to stay with him. And there were so many of them, they had them in the cafeteria because they couldn't do it. The halls were full of people. Immigration was one of the things there. The immigrants is another thing that the bishops of the Global South pointed out. They want to keep the Paris Accords. They want to keep to the 1.5 centigrade temperatures. We're about at 2 now. We're still going up, not down. And so they are pointing that out in a big way. It didn't really come off at COP30, but 2 countries decided to pick it up and do it again next year, Colombia and the Netherlands, at a coal port where they produce and ship coal out of Colombia, the 5th biggest coal producer in the world. Anyway, that was kind of the post COP30 results, because the meeting itself did not take seriously what the bishops were talking about and their commitments. I think you also asked, what are you doing now, or what are some of the current projects?
Yes.
One of them is something that's back in my old home parish. There was a company that wanted to bring in a truck filling station to the port on the bay of San Diego. There's a port, and they were to bring in somewhere between 75 and 100 petroleum and gas burning trucks every day to this filling station. The people said no. The air is polluted now. When I was a pastor there was a high rate of asthma amongst the grade school kids right across the street from the parish, only a half a mile from where they wanted to put this filling station. So in 3 different nights, one of them ending at 1 o'clock in the morning, the parish council finally, or not the parish council, the city council voted 5-0 against that project. Now there's another project, and I got put out to be the person to get it out to the people. So I just sent out to 50 environmental groups about another project, which is the electric trucks at the port of National City. Another one is a friend of mine who is a neighbor where I live, called Grid Alternatives. They bring low-cost solar panels to low-income families, and they just opened it up to churches and businesses. Of our 97 parishes, over 50% have solar panels, but the poorer or smaller parishes can't afford them. So I'm trying to engineer that this group that receives money, at least they used to receive money from the federal government and from the state, to help low-income people have solar panels. They're looking into the possibility of doing that for our small churches. There's a couple of other little projects that I'm looking at, and that is getting rid of using plastic cups. And I just did the turkey trot for our Father Joe's villages, and they had 8,500 paid runners, and probably that many more that weren't paid. They were handing them out plastic water bottles at the end. So we're going to try and change that around.
So we do appreciate so much. Your history is so interesting, and I think that you didn't expect that missionary work early in your ministry, but it has all come together. All those experiences brought you to where you are today, and making such a difference. So, like I said, we could probably do 3 podcasts. There's so many things going on. None of it was
planned. I mean, I just moved as the Spirit moved me, I guess, and some of it I couldn't believe myself. How did I end up here? It's kind of like
God's plan.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I enjoy the opportunity to speak, tell my little story.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Father, for joining us today and for sharing not only your own personal history and your own story, but also just providing more information about Creation Care Ministry and all of your ministry. And just thank you for your example as well. And we also want to just thank all of our listeners for taking the time to listen to today's episode of Illuminating Catholics to learn more about Laudato Si and our roles in caring for the environment. Just remember that new episodes drop each Tuesday wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also find us on the Diocesan YouTube channel or at lumenmedia.org.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Illuminating Catholics, shedding light to understand the modern church. Follow us for more episodes on topics of the Catholic faith. For more diocesan news, visit lumenmedia.org.